The bell above the door rang noisily as I entered the bookshop. My hopes of just browsing through the books without attracting the attention of a well-intentioned but usually annoying clerk were immediately dashed. I hate to be bothered while perusing the shelves, but upon closing the door and getting my first glance at the shop itself, I decided that due to the smallness of the shop and the type of books it contained, I was more likely to have to search out the proprietor myself if need be. The shop was hard to find, and even more difficult to understand. While bookshelves covered nearly every wall from floor to ceiling, they were all completely empty. The only volumes I could see were the 20 or so that were displayed on a long wooden table in the middle of the room, along with just a few more that were on what I supposed passed for the counter where business was transacted. As I crossed the shop to look at the volumes on the table, I noticed how dim the lighting was and how old everything seemed to be. This building had housed some sort of shop for a long time, and the wood and fixtures were definitely showing their age. It was just the kind of shop that I love to find. In my search for rare and unusual books, I find shops like this one usually hold the greatest treasures. All of the books were bound in leather, which was very encouraging to me. While leather does not necessarily mean a rare or valuable book, it certainly piques my interest. I traced my fingers along the surface of the books, admiring the craftsmanship of the leather bindings and the titles etched in them. "May I help you?" a voice asked just behind my right shoulder. Startled, I turned very quickly and nearly spilled several of the books off the table. "Please be careful, sir," the voice said again. "These books are quite valuable." The voice belonged to a short, elderly man dressed in a black suit that was probably as old as he was. Bald and slightly hunched over, he looked every bit the bookstore owner. "Sorry," I said as I straightened the books. "I didn't hear you come up behind me." "That's quite all right, sir," he said as he extended his hand to shake mine. "My name is William Gilchrist." "Pleased to meet you," I said, shaking his hand. "Alistair Fry." "Welcome to my shop, Mr. Fry." "Thank you. I must say that your selection of books is quite limited given all the shelf space you have." I immediately regretted saying that, as I might very well have insulted him. However, if I had, he seemed not to care. As I've gotten older, Mr. Fry, I found my taste in literature has become, well, more specialized. I have sold or given away the majority of my inventory and retained only the volumes that have special value to me. They have become more of a personal collection now. I take it they are still for sale. Gilchrist looked at me with a nervous smile. "Oh yes, but may I say that the prices are quite steep. Rarity and collectability are seldom inexpensive," I said as I turned back to the book-laden table. "I had a hard time finding your shop. It is quite well hidden among all these side streets and alleyways," I said as I picked up the topmost book on the table. "Rarity and collectability may sometimes require extra effort as well, don't you think, Mr. Fry?" "Very true, Mr. Gilchrist, very true." I wasn't long into examining the books on the table when I started to notice a pattern in the subjects of the books. Each of them seemed to deal with what I would call the darker side of humanity. There were many volumes about murders and torture in the Middle Ages, as well as several volumes about famous, or, should I say, infamous, crimes and their perpetrators. While I never held much esteem for this genre of literature, I must admit that, rather ashamedly, I was curious about the contents of these books. I am more than a little surprised at the subject matter of these books, and maybe even more surprised that these are the only books that you chose to hold on to out of your entire collection, I said to the shopkeeper. "Mr. Fry, in spite of what the literary community may think of this type of literature, I have always been fascinated by the subject of man's inherent capability to bring harm to others. Man's inhumanity to man, as they say." His eyes seemed to brighten as he spoke of this, and I found myself beginning to feel a twinge of apprehension about continuing this conversation. I took a half step towards the front door of the shop. "Please, Mr. Fry, don't be put off by my affection for these books. I assure you that it is merely a hobby of mine, not a lifestyle. I only read about these subjects. I don't participate. As he said this, his face took on a friendlier aura, and his smile was genuine and reassuring. "Come, let me show you some of my treasures." After what must have been a half hour or so, I was tiring of Gilchrist's endless sales pitch about his valueless, but admittedly intriguing books. I found myself actually having some desire to read some of the books, but not enough to pay the exorbitant amounts of money he was asking for them. The subject matter alone brought on some degree of hesitancy on my part. "Mr. Gilchrist," I said, interrupting his latest soliloquy on a book about unsolved murders in Europe. I believe that was the subject, for my mind had started wandering some time back. "While your collection is certainly interesting, I find it somewhat morbid and also very expensive. I believe I am ready to take my leave, and to thank you for your time." Gilchrist looked disappointed and somewhat, well, frightened, as strange as that seemed to me. "Oh no, Mr. Fry. Please remain a short while longer, as I have one more book I would love to show you. I believe you will find its subject matter, as well as its asking price, to be quite attractive." Gilchrist turned and began to work his way towards the counter in the rear of the shop. "Really, Mr. Gilchrist, I don't think I would be interested. Please, Mr. Fry, indulge an old man for just a few moments longer." I found both the look on his face and his genuine excitement to be enough to convince myself that a few more moments would not inconvenience me that much. It was very apparent that he did not get many opportunities to show off his rather meager collection. "Very well, sir, one last volume." His gleeful reaction was such that, while I value my time very much, I knew I had made the right decision in humoring Mr. Gilchrist for a few more moments. He removed a leather-bound volume from a back shelf that until now had completely escaped my notice. As he brought it to me to look at, he carefully wiped away any dust from the cover, and with a great deal of care, placed the book on the table. "This book is the prize of my collection," said Gilchrist. "I keep it on the back shelf to protect it from those who may not realize its value. I trust you, however, Mr. Fry. Please take a look." The book was bound in very expensive-looking brown leather. It also had a leather strap with a bronze buckle, so that the book could be securely closed. While still in quite good condition, it was obvious that the book was very old and had been handled frequently. However, there was no title to the book, either on the cover or on the binding. I was quite puzzled by that, and it must have shown on my face, as Gilchrist picked up my thoughts right away. "The title is on the opening page. You'll have to undo the buckle to discover what it is." While I found having to do as he asked to be somewhat tedious, I had gone this far, so I undid the buckle and strap to open the book. Mr. Gilchrist was nearly giddy with excitement. The title of the book was Acts of Vengeance. What struck me the most is that the title, as was the rest of the book, as I would soon discover, was handwritten. I was amazed that a book of this size, which consisted of what had to be nearly 1,000 pages, was totally written in longhand. Being a connoisseur of valuable books, it was apparent to me that this book was a journal or diary of some sort. My interest in this book was increasing by the minute. "I must admit that this book is very unusual," I said, turning to Mr. Gilchrist. "How is it that you came by it?" "I purchased it when I was a young lad, and I have had it in my possession for a very long time," Gilchrist said. "Well, it certainly is curious. I will have to say again that the subject matter is of little interest to me, but the book itself would be a great conversation piece to add to my personal collection." Gilchrist agreed. "I can assure you, Mr. Fry, that the book will be a welcome addition to your library. Would you have any interest in purchasing it?" Taking up the book and examining it again, I replied, "Yes, Mr. Gilchrist, I believe I might, if your asking price isn't too steep." Gilchrist took a moment to think about how to begin the negotiation. Finally, he offered up a price that was half the price he was asking for every other book in the shop. "That is a very reasonable price, Mr. Gilchrist. Maybe too reasonable. I can't help but feel I would be taking advantage of you," I said, knowing full well in my mind that I would pay much more for this book if need be. I was developing a sort of attachment to it. Nonsense, Mr. Fry. You would be doing me a great service. I have been the proprietor of this shop for a very long time, and I am in hopes of retiring soon. It would be of great comfort to me to know that the book is in the hands of someone who will take care of it and treasure it for what it is. I can hardly refuse then, can I? I have a bag left to put it in," he said as he took the money I gave him and stuffed it into the pocket of his suit coat. "That isn't necessary, sir. I have my satchel here. It will protect it very well until I return home. I am very grateful for your time and your generosity." Gilchrist looked at me with a look of both relief and sadness. "It is I who am grateful, sir. You have put my mind at ease much more than you will ever know. Good day." "Good day to you, sir," I said as I turned and opened the door. I remember the little bell over the door singing out again as I exited the shop. However, this time I found it not quite so annoying. As Gilchrist watched the door to the shop close behind Alistair Fry, he could feel it begin to happen. His part in this nightmare was nearing completion. After decades of frustration, he had finally finished. He felt terrible for Mr. Fry, but that emotion was far outweighed by the relief he was experiencing. Gilchrist made sure the door was locked and slowly turned to walk to the rear of the shop. He passed through a curtain leading to the back room, which had long since ceased to be a storage room. It was his living quarters and had been for many years. He walked up to an old dresser with many old photographs on top of it. A tear came to his eye as he looked upon the faded photographs of his wife and family for the last time. They had all passed away long ago. Gilchrist had outlived them all. Not surprising at all, given the fact that Gilchrist was almost 200 years old. Lovingly touching each photograph, Gilchrist spoke very softly. "Please forgive me. I had no choice." Gilchrist turned away, removed all of his torn and tattered clothing, and went to sit in an old chair, the fabric of which had worn thin with age. Tears began to pour from his eyes as he fearfully realized what would happen next. "At last, this is over. God forgive me." Gilchrist began to moan as the pain began. Almost tolerable at first, but as the seconds passed, his groans turned to screams. His body began to shrivel as if all of the moisture it contained was being slowly drained out. His skin began to mummify, and his eyes shrank back into his head. His arms and legs twisted into horrible angles, and his chest and stomach receded until his backbone was visible from the front. Still screaming, Gilchrist began to fall apart, his jaws falling open in a horrible gaping maw. As his screams finally began to fade, he managed to repeat once more, "At last." 5 minutes later, Gilchrist was gone, his body reduced to nothing more than an unrecognizable mound in the seat of the old chair, a mound of dust and bone. I quite forgot about the book for a short period of time. I brought it back home to my townhouse and placed it next to my reading chair in the library. Then, due to my life becoming completely unraveled, I spent very little time reading it all. My wife, Grace, chose that time to announce that she was leaving me. I was nearly overcome with shock at the news. I knew full well that our marriage was by no means perfect, but I had no inkling that she thought it was imperfect enough to dissolve it. There have been pressures on our marriage since the beginning. My long hours at the accounting firm where I was employed, my passion for books, which Grace deemed ridiculous, her constant absence from home, working at various charities throughout the city, and most damaging of all, our marriage was childless. Not because we were unable to have a child, but because Grace would have none of it. I had resolved myself to never be a father, and it still remained an open sore of resentment between us. I tried to speak to Grace on several occasions about the possibility of saving our marriage, but she was immovable on the subject. She kept to her room, only emerging to leave the house. One night, upon returning home from work, she and everything she considered hers were gone. I sat alone in the dark all that night, trying to decide what I would do now. I finally determined that the best course of action for me was to hate her. The carriage pulled up in front of the 2-story brick building located just off the main square of the city. The sign over the door read D. Cross, accountant. That would be Damien Cross, my employer. A likable enough fellow, but a bit full of himself for owning the most well-known accounting firm in the city. What was not well known was that Damien Cross knew very little about accounting. He had inherited the firm from his father, and if not for the expertise of his employees, the doors would have been shuttered long ago. Just as I have for 1,000 other mornings, I entered the front door and made my way to my desk, situated in the very back corner of the room. My desk was away from any windows or doors. I had become accustomed to this spot because I could get far more work done there. I was seldom disturbed. On this particular day, that was not to be the case. It was late afternoon, and I was doing very well with lessening my workload. I like to have a clear desk when I leave for the day. Suddenly, I sensed someone standing at the front of my desk. Raising my head from my work, I was startled by the sight of Damien Cross staring down at me, his arms virtually loaded with papers and ledger books. "Sorry, Mr. Cross, I was lost in what I was doing, and I didn't realize that you were standing there," I said as I nervously rose to my feet. "That's quite all right, Fry," he said as he took all the documents he was carrying and loudly dropped them on my desk. "I appreciate employees who are so involved in their work." "Thank you, sir." I was developing a bad feeling about what was going to happen next, which is exactly why I have chosen you to finish this large project for me. Mr. Danford expects all of his accounts to be in order for a presentation to a potential buyer by Monday morning. They are quite a mess, I'm afraid, Damien said, obviously enjoying himself, unsure that it will take the rest of this evening and most of the weekend to complete. But Mr. Cross, I stammered, I have commitments for this weekend that have long been in the planning. "I'm sure you do, Fry," he said, obviously bothered by my objection, "but I have made this commitment to Mr. Danford, and it is one I intend to fulfill. My hope is that your commitment, or shall I say, dependence, on your employment here is equally important to you. After all, it's not like you have a wife or family to go home to." Instantly, I was both ashamed and infuriated. How dare he bring up my home life and use it as a weapon against me in this battle of wills? "Mr. Cross, I am appalled," I yelled. Yes, I'm sure you are," Cross said as he began to turn away. "The question is, Fry, how appalled are you? Enough to end your employment here, or not?" Resisting every urge to pommel Cross for his unbelievable behavior, I sat back in my chair. Given my present situation, which Cross was well aware of, I could not refuse. "Very well, Mr. Cross," I said with my eyes down. "I'll finish the project." "I knew you would, Fry," he said with his usual arrogance. "I knew you would. Now, as you can see, while you were making a much bigger issue out of this than it should have been, everyone else has gone home. Here is the key to the front door. Let yourself in and out as much as you need to in order to finish the work this weekend. Now lock the door behind me when I leave," he said, getting his coat. "My new lady friend awaits me in the carriage outside." I followed Damien to the front door to lock up as he asked, my hatred for the man nearly boiling over. As he stepped through the door, I saw the carriage that awaited him. As the carriage driver opened the door for him, I caught a glimpse of the woman who was waiting for him. She nodded ever so slightly when she saw me, with a wry smile that clearly demonstrated her air of superiority. Damien Cross leaned over as he sat down and gave her a kiss. His new lady friend was my wife, Grace. I instantly flew into a rage. I began to throw papers and ledgers off all of the desks. I sent lamps and inkwells flying against the walls. I wanted to do so much more damage, but eventually I just sank down to the floor and wept. I don't recall how long I was there, but I eventually left to begin what would be a very long walk home. I left the front door to the accounting firm wide open when I left, hoping that one of the more nefarious people who wander the street at night would find their way in and wreak more havoc upon Cross's offices. It would serve him right. I arrived at my home in the middle of the night. Exhausted, I sat down rather heavily in my reading chair in the library, determined to drink myself into a stupor Before I could accomplish that, however, I noticed the book I had purchased at the bookshop. For some reason, it stood out to me, even though it was nearly buried in a pile of books I had yet to read. Maybe it caught my eye because of the title. Acts of Vengeance, how appropriate, for on my long walk home, I had been deliberating on how I would seek vengeance and retribution from both my harlot wife and that bastard ex-boss of mine, Ding and Cross. I removed the book from the pile and held it for a moment. I was anxious to discover what was written inside, but for some unknown reason, I was hesitant to do so. It was almost as if it would be a point of no return for me if I opened this book. I continued to hold the book without opening it. Eventually, after much thought, my curiosity began to outweigh my trepidation, and I opened the book. Upon first inspection, the book seemed to be normal and not at all unusual, albeit well worn. However, I did notice that it had no print date or copyright. Even more strangely, it did not list the author's name anywhere. I found that very odd. The title page simply offered up just that, the title. Acts of Vengeance was clearly handwritten in a very strong and exaggerated style of calligraphy. I found the page that followed most intriguing. It held several lines of what I determined to be a language I was not familiar with. There were various angled but straight lines, along with other symbols I did not recognize and was unable to decipher. I considered this to be a puzzle to be solved later, as I wanted to explore the rest of the book. As I turned the pages, I found the book to be divided into many sections, each written in distinctively different handwriting. Some sections were in cursive, and some were printed. Some are easy to read, some are almost illegible. I turned back to the beginning of the book and began to read the first section. As I read, I was astounded to find that it was the full account of a man who had sought revenge against a neighboring landowner, whom he accused of stealing food from his barns. It was very apparent from the wording that he used in telling his story that it had happened a long time ago. The story was complete in every detail, up to and including the gory retelling of how the man exacted his revenge by finding the man out working his fields and running him through dozens of times with a pitchfork. The delight the author took in this vengeful act was very apparent in his writing, while I found myself sickened by his grim tale. He even signed his work, Horace Black. While I was taken aback by the story, I became fascinated enough that I had to read the rest of the chapters. Each one was a grisly tale of vengeance, authored by the person who exacted their revenge. As I read, I began to have my own thoughts of vengeance against those who had wronged me. Morbid fantasies filled my mind as I considered seeking justice against them. However, I knew that I was not cut from that cloth. Violence just wasn't in me. I read a few more of the chapters, those that were legible, and found myself becoming physically ill as I read how people had gone to great and violent lengths to get back at those who had wronged them. Without realizing it, I had read all night. The sunlight was just inching its way across the floor as I came to the last entry in the book. Exhausted, I considered saving it for another time, but my mind was far from being capable of sleep, so I decided to read it after all. This last entry was by far the most disturbing. The author wrote of how his siblings had conspired to cheat him out of his rightful inheritance. He had shown little interest in the family business, instead choosing to pursue a degree in literature. This infuriated his brothers, who considered him lazy and unworthy of a share of the family fortune. Using deception and unscrupulous lawyers, they were successful in denying him his share. Something in his mind snapped. Betrayal and vengeance drove him beyond the limits of what he thought he was capable of. His entry went on to describe how, one evening, soon after the betrayal, under the guise of reconciling with his brothers, he arranged to visit them in their inherited mansion. While he appeared to be sincere about mending the rift in the family, his motives were much more sinister. About halfway through dinner, the drug he had managed to slip into their food began to take effect. The drug was not meant to kill, but rather to incapacitate. The brothers were not able to move but remained fully conscious. The author taunted them and laughed in their faces. He tortured them with their own dinnerware until they were bloody and torn. Then, in one last, ultimate act of vengeance, he set fire to the room. He stayed as long as he could, watching the flames lick at the flesh of his brothers, their eyes wide with terror. He laughed maniacally as he left the house, more than a little disappointed that he would not be able to watch them burn. How horrible! This entry was by far the most diabolical and disturbing. It occurred to me that each entry was worse than the one before in terms of how gruesome the murderous acts were. I was glad to be done with the book. As I began to close it, I noticed that the last entry, like many of the others, bore the signature of its author. As I read it, sheer terror took over my every thought. I met this murderer just a short time ago. The author's name was William Gilchrist, the proprietor of the bookstore. As soon as I recognized the author's name, a jolt like a powerful electric current coursed through my body. I wanted desperately to jump out of my chair, but I found myself unable to move. The pain was excruciating. I resigned myself to the fact that the pain had rendered me motionless except for the violent spasms that every muscle in my body was experiencing. My only hope was that this seizure, or whatever it was, would be short-lived. My mind had remained very clear through this ordeal so far, but that was soon to end. I became disoriented. Not dizzy, rather, but unable to maintain my thought processes. I could no longer concentrate. It was as though my thoughts were no longer my own. A montage of pictures and ideas swirled before my eyes, which were tightly closed due to the pain I was in. The thoughts in my mind were horrible. My mind was creating terrible visions of the stories of vengeance I had just read. They were rapidly appearing in my mind's eye with startling and vivid detail. It was as if I were witnessing all of the brutal murders that had taken place in the book. The book. That's it. In some mysterious way, the book has to be the cause of this. If I can just get away from it, I can remove myself from this nightmare. With every bit of strength and will I could muster, I tried to force myself to release the book, which was still open in my hands. But however hard I tried, I could not let go. Fighting through the pain, I lifted the book from my lap. What I saw nearly drove me beyond the limits of my own sanity. The words in the book had turned red, as if they were written in blood. There were rivulets of red running down the pages, dripping off the bottom of the book and landing in my lap as large, awful drops. Once again, I attempted to throw the book away from me, but I could not. It was as if the book was glued to my hands, when in fact it was much worse. I began to scream as I realized that I was not gripping the book. The book was gripping me. The leather cover of the book had somehow grown over my fingers and hands and engulfed them almost up to the wrist. I was virtually a prisoner of the book. The pain grew more and more intense until I felt myself losing consciousness. Trapped in a dreamlike state, the visions of murder and torture became incredibly vivid. Gruesome and bloody deaths kept repeating in my mind, each one more horrible than the last. It was as if I were witnessing each death from above. And as I watched, I found my attitude towards them changing. I began to be less offended by them, and actually started admiring some of the ingenuity that went into some of them, as well as taking some joy in the sheer viciousness of the crimes. As I watched, something incredible began to happen. As each scenario played out in my mind, I noticed that the murderer in each of the visions was somehow becoming familiar to me. His back was always towards me, so I had not recognized him before. Now, however, in one last blood-soaked vision, the murderer turned to look at me. I screamed in pure terror. It was like looking into a mirror. My face was twisted into the most terrifying, maniacal smile. I realized that the familiar figure in all of these diabolical acts was me. And just before I passed out, I saw that the victim of my butchery in this last vision had been Ding and Cross. I am not sure how much time passed before I woke up. However, judging by my ruddy appearance and aching muscles, it had been quite a while. I prepared a light breakfast and went into the bathroom to make myself somewhat presentable. Halfway through shaving, I realized that I did not really have any reason to actually be presentable since my wife was now gone, and I am certain that my actions at the accounting firm had resulted in my termination. As I thought about my present circumstances, I sensed a growing fury inside of me. I had done absolutely nothing to deserve what was happening to me. All my years of fidelity to my wife and loyalty to my employer had been thrown away like so much garbage. I stood to lose everything I had worked so hard for. My career, my marriage, even my dignity. No one could take that away from me. As I stroked the last bit of shaving cream off my face, the glint of the straight razor caught my eye. I held it in front of me and admired the ivory handle and the brightness of the blade. It was so beautiful. I was taken with the idea that while the razor was designed to be a useful tool, it was also a dangerous and effective weapon. As I continued to look at it, I began to picture in my mind how the razor could certainly be a perfect instrument of justice and revenge. Looking into the mirror, I noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the disheveled look of a broken man, and the evil smile. I took another step, this time placing my foot as close to the end of the step as possible. Grasping the railing of the staircase as tightly as I could, I climbed the stairs at a painstakingly slow pace. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, suddenly realizing that I had never been upstairs in the house. Which room was Damien's bedroom? My confidence began to waver, as I had no desire to search all the rooms while attempting to avoid detection. After a few moments, I collected my wits and realized that I could determine where the bedroom was by remembering the last light to go out in the house. It only made sense that it would be the right room. Knowing where that light had been, I was able to find my way to what I believed to be the correct door. I put my ear against the door and listened for several minutes. It was hard to hear anything, because my heart was pumping so fast that all I could hear was my own blood rushing through my veins. Willing myself to calm down, eventually I was able to hear someone snoring in the room. This was the moment I had been waiting for. There was no turning back. I could hardly contain myself as I reached for the doorknob. I pulled my hand back quickly to cover my mouth. I had this insane urge to laugh. I was about to commit the ultimate act of evil, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. Finally, I was ready. I slowly turned the doorknob and entered the room, ever so quietly. The bedroom was pitch black. Long, heavy fabric curtains cut off almost all of whatever light was trying to enter through the window. I stopped just inside the doorway to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. In just a few moments, I was able to make out where everything was in the room. The large four-poster bed was directly across the room from where I stood. Straight razor in hand, I proceeded ever so slowly towards the bed. Damien Cross was fast asleep, snoring annoyingly. I was thankful for the noise, as it would help to cover up any sounds I might make as I crossed the room. After what seemed to be hours, I finally stood above him next to the bed. He was sleeping on his back, and very conveniently had his throat exposed to the night. This was it. This was my moment of revenge. This is where I exacted vengeance on the man who had cost me everything. Still, I hesitated, not because I was having second thoughts or because I had grown afraid. No, it was because I wanted to enjoy every second of taking this man's life. I had envisioned this moment in my mind many times. Now I wanted to make sure I did this right. I wanted him to feel the pain. I wanted him to suffer. Most importantly, I wanted him to know who his killer was. I wanted him to know it was me. I bent over him low enough to hold the razor just a hair's breadth from his throat. I had to time this perfectly. Damien was a large man, and should he begin to struggle, this could all go horribly wrong. I placed my other hand a few inches above his mouth. My intent was to clamp down on his mouth just before I drew the razor across his throat. My hands were shaking in anticipation. I had to strike now. I slammed my hand across his mouth while at the same time pushing down with all my strength to keep his head in place. His eyes flew open, focusing on me almost immediately. I could see so much in his eyes. The recognition of who I was and the terror of realizing what I was about to do. Damien began to kick at me and strike at my face. I would have no more time to savor the moment. I must strike. I drew the razor across his throat. I have never seen so much blood. It sprayed out like a geyser, covering both him and me. Instincts drove me to jump away from him for just a second. Miraculously, he rose from the bed, hands to his throat, and tried to run, but his body was already failing him. After I recovered from the initial shock of what I had done, my anger consumed me. "Die, you bastard!" I yelled as I slashed at him again. The blade hit his face, cutting through his left cheek and exiting through the right. I began to slash wildly as he stood helplessly in front of me. "You too okay my wifey, slash. You too okay my career, slash. You too okay my whole life, slash." I suddenly realized that my blows were no longer striking anything. I was flailing the razor in the air. Completely out of breath, I stopped. Damien lay on the floor between me and the bed. His face and hands were sliced to ribbons. Fingers and eyes were missing, and blood pooled on the floor around his head. I had done it. I had killed the man who ruined me. I had taken my revenge. I stood in the dark for what seemed like a long time, but probably was only a few moments. I can only describe what I was feeling as pure ecstasy. I felt no remorse or fear. For the first time in my life, I felt like a man. Like I had accomplished something. I felt complete. Then everything was shattered with one sound. "Damien?" A female voice said. "Are you all right?" I spun around to find the silhouette of a woman standing in the doorway of the bedroom. Dressed in a flowing nightdress with a lit candle in her hand was my wife, Grace. We both recognized each other at the same instant. Her first reaction was to retreat back into the hallway in an effort to run away down the hall. My first reaction was to smile and take a moment, however brief, to revel in the idea that my revenge was not yet complete. This was more than I could hope for. It must have been quite a sight to see Grace running towards the stairway, one hand holding up the hems of her nightdress, while the other held on to the candle lamp to light her way. And I, with one hand stretching out to grab her and the other hand brandishing the straight razor, she was screaming at the top of her lungs while I called for her to stop. I must admit, I was laughing as well. I caught up to her at the top of the stairway and grabbed her by the back of the neck. As I spun her around, she tried to strike me with the candle lamp. She missed and only succeeded in spraying us both with hot wax. Neither of us noticed the pain. "Stop, Alistair. Stop," she pleaded with me. "You can't kill me. You just can't." "Oh, but I can," I replied. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, choking back tears and gasping for breath. "How can you ask me that question?" I yelled back at her, spittle splashing onto her face. "You treated me like garbage our whole married life. You only wanted what my salary could get you. When that wasn't enough, you left me for that dead man in the other room. And now I find you living in his house. Are you sleeping in his bed too?" "No, Alistair," she cried. "I am only—" "Oh, poor Damien." "Shut up," I yelled, bringing her face closer to me as I tightened my grip on her throat. "I have no desire to hear your excuses or your pleas for mercy. Your words mean nothing to me, as mine have meant nothing to you for years." I brought the razor up to her face and pressed it against her cheek. "The only thing that matters to me now is that you pay the price for your disloyalty and infidelity." I leaned forward and kissed her. It was a hard, violent kiss. A kiss goodbye. I shoved her backward as hard as I could. She had no time to react. She landed hard on her back, her head snapping violently back against the step. I heard her neck snap, her screams ending abruptly. She continued to roll down the steps, finally coming to rest at the bottom of the staircase, with her body broken and her arms and legs at impossible angles. As I looked at her lying there, I was struck with sadness, a sadness that her suffering was over so quickly. I did not want this night to end. I had no idea that vengeance and murder could be so joyful or fulfilling. Before leaving, I made sure that there was no one else in the house, such as a butler or a maid. Regrettably, I found no one. I left the house of Damien Cross that night knowing that I had exacted the ultimate revenge on those who had wronged me. I returned to my home just before dawn. I had discarded the razor in the sewers on the way. I proceeded to build a fire and burn all the clothes I had worn that night. I would leave no evidence of ever being in the Cross home that night. I sat at my desk in the library and pondered what I had done. The more I thought about it, the happier I became. My vengeance was complete, and I was ecstatic about it. As I sat there, I found myself drawn to the book that had started this journey into murder. Remembering what happened the last time I handled it, I was hesitant to pick it up. However, my curiosity finally got the best of me. Very gently, I picked up the book. This time, there was no pain or disorientation. Rather, there was more of a calming but invigorating effect. The cover of the book did not envelop me again. However, there was a feeling of ownness, joy, and accomplishment. I flipped through the now familiar pages, remembering some of the written accounts as I saw them. Eventually, I came to William Gilchrist's gruesome account of his act of vengeance. I was no longer repulsed by his actions. Instead, the story of his revenge gladdened me. I could now relate to what he had done. In some strange way, we were now brothers, albeit murderous brothers. I was about to close the book when I noticed a change in the pages. Terror reclaimed me as I saw that Gilchrist's story was no longer the last one in the book. There was another entry, and as I began to read it, I instantly began to shake uncontrollably. This cannot be. This new story was mine. It was the written account of every horrible atrocity I had committed in the Cross House. Every grisly detail was written down. It was all in my handwriting, and my signature was on the last page. My mind began to spin, and I felt as if my actions were no longer my own. I began to thrash about uncontrollably in my chair, eventually falling to the floor, frothing at the mouth. I tried to scream, but my throat was so constricted in fear that I could not. The book fell from the desk, landing open directly in front of my face. To my horror, the pages began to turn, working their way to the front of the book. I was physically and mentally trapped. I could not move, and I could not look away. Finally, the pages stopped turning. I realized that the book was now open to the page that contained the strange language and symbols. The lines began to blur and change. I could not look away. The lines started to become recognizable. The words began to appear in English. I was afraid to read them, afraid of what they might say. As it turned out, my fears were well-founded. I felt as though I would lose whatever fragile grip I had on my sanity as I read. Vengeance has been exacted on those who deserve it most, doled out by the spirits of this book. To whom you have played host, how many are they that deserve this fate? As many as those who have died. Where and when will vengeance strike next? The spirits and the book will decide. It was now clear to me what had happened. I had been, and woefully still am, possessed by the book to carry out its plan to kill those who it decided had committed evil. I was no more than a tool of this horrible spirit. At the same time I realized this, it became clear that I was never going to be released from this horror. I was doomed to obey the wishes of whatever spirit this was, and I would be forced to do his bidding. I lay on the floor of my library for a very long time as I lamented the effect this would have on the rest of my life. After many hours of resisting the power of this spirit, I realized my efforts were futile. With mind, body, and soul, I gave in to the spirit of the book. I knew what I had to do. The bell above the door rang annoyingly as I entered the old bookstore. I had never known that this bookstore existed until I felt the need to come to this side of town. Being a collector of rare books, I was excited to come across this tiny shop. Just as I began to look over the small inventory that the shop had to offer, I was interrupted by the appearance of a very old man, nervous and shaking. "Welcome to my shop," the old man said. "I am the proprietor, Alistair Fry." My brother has always had a dream of being a great filmmaker. For as long as I can remember, it's been his obsession. He got a video camera for his 8th birthday and would literally film everything with it, even the most mundane things. He would have us do interviews for the camera and make little movies for himself. I thought it was cute at first, and I really did. I would always help him with whatever little project he was doing this time. As time went on, something started to change. I can't really say what made him the way he was, but he became increasingly arrogant and difficult. Our parents definitely spoiled him. He spent a small fortune making sure he got the education he needed to pursue his dream of becoming a director, paid for any of the expensive equipment he needed for making and editing his own little movies, and helped pay the salaries of any crew or actors he hired for the little short films he produced. Maybe it was that made him so arrogant and mean-spirited, but increasingly he became that worst kind of cliché. The artist obsessed with their vision and treating everyone in their lives like crap, the self-centered, petulant child in an adult's body. I'd like to say that I called him out on any of this, but the sad fact is that I went right along with him on it. It started in his teens, verbal abuse and the occasional slap any time I didn't do something right or quickly enough for his liking. I should have stood up to him and told him to get lost, but I found myself totally under his thumb, unable to say no or simply get him out of my life. To be honest, looking back, I can see just how unhealthy the whole thing was. Now, before you get the wrong idea, there was never anything incestuous here. My brother was just a bully, a little tyrant who enjoyed bossing people around, and I basically became his personal servant. He would belittle me and everything I thought, said, or tried to do. Anytime I tried to build myself up, he'd tear me down and make me feel like I couldn't accomplish anything on my own. I couldn't even survive out there without him. I should have known better, I suppose, but it had started when we were so young that honestly, a part of me came to genuinely believe the things he said. A part of me was so scared of trying to make it out there in the big wide world by myself that I put up with my brother's constant bullying and taunting and increasingly shrill, angry demands, because I was scared of being alone and being cut off from the only family I had left. Our parents had passed away by this point, and we had no contact with the rest of the family. Without my brother, I'd be all by myself. His overbearing presence in my life had prevented me from making any real friends, and the thought of trying to build a life for myself was one that just terrified me. So I did as I was told. He would say, "Joan, get me coffee," and I'd drive all the way across town to the Starbucks he liked to get him coffee. He'd say he needed extras, and I'd devote weeks of my life to arranging and carrying out interviews. He'd demand some expensive piece of equipment, and I'd spend however much it cost to get it. That is my life now. My brothers are PAs, or maids. The subject of my brother's short films and mini documentaries had become increasingly dark and surreal over the years. He would create short, strange, and frightening little pieces designed only to unsettle and scare, or sometimes just ones that were so bizarre, so utterly devoid of plot, logic, or reason, that it was impossible to tell what, if anything, he was trying to achieve or convey with them. His documentaries were much the same. He would either film about gang crime, serial killers, and rapes, or else create disjointed scenes. He once filmed a dog, starving and injured, on the street for several hours, just filming it struggling to move and to breathe. I just filmed the thing's pain. Some nights when I went down to get a glass of water, I would see him sitting there in the lounge, in the dark, watching these movies he made. I was just staring at the screen. And then one day he told me about what his newest film was to be about. It turned out that he'd begun to hear stories of an urban legend in the film industry. It wasn't something that was widely talked about or acknowledged, and the people who did talk about it always seemed to do so with a certain nervousness and paranoia, as if afraid that even mentioning it was dangerous. It was called Better Films. Supposedly, it was a studio or individual who made incredibly strange movies. None of those we talked to who would admit to having watched a Better Films production would go into any detail about what was on the tapes, and the films were only available on VHS, from what we could uncover, but all of them seemed to be incredibly disturbed by what they had seen. One had gone so far as to remove anything from their home that could play video or audio. A guy who ran a small DVD and video store told us that he'd met with some representatives of Better Films just once, a pair of men dressed in red suits. He'd described them as looking like they'd been mutilated, and claimed that one had been missing an eye and an ear while another was minus a hand and his nose. The scarring around these wounds looked ugly and raw. They'd given him a business card that had nothing on it except for the logo, a cartoonish, childlike drawing of a frowning face, and the tagline "Making Better Films for a Better Audience," along with a website address where they claimed he could purchase their titles for his store if he wished to help support independent art. He checked it out, expecting some kind of artsy foreign stuff in black and white. He had instead found a site full of strange and confusing clips that left him scratching his head, and that provided no clear way to order anything. He said the whole web page appeared to be in Japanese. And yet a week later, a black bin bag was on the front step of his shop, and inside were several tapes, all with the Better Films logo on their labels. We asked him if he still had the tapes, and my brother in particular was very insistent that we get to watch them. The man refused, and my brother offered him increasingly large sums of money to buy or borrow one of the tapes. Finally, the man just held up a finger to my brother's lips before speaking. "Now you listen to me and listen well, boy. I've seen your type. I know the look you have in your eye right now. I get a lot of weirdos in here browsing the adult section, asking if I've got anything stronger. I know what you're after. I know what you're thinking. So I'm going to tell you this, and then you're going to leave my store. What's on those tapes ain't no illegal little thrill for some gorehound trying to find himself a real-life snuff movie. What's on those tapes isn't anything like what you're imagining. What's on those tapes is worse. And I ain't selling or renting them to anyone, especially not some half-witted little pervert with more money than sense." My brother stormed out in a rage, with me following close behind. As I left, the store owner called out to me. I turned to see him looking at me, with an expression of genuine concern on his face now. "You want my advice? You stay away from him, miss. Things he's looking into, you don't want nothing to do with." I suppose I should have taken his advice, but by this point, I doubt there was anything that could convince me to abandon my brother. So great was the hold he had over me. And so I continued to assist him as he dug deeper and deeper into the mystery of Better Films. We managed to piece a few things together. The earliest encounter anyone seemed to have had with their works seemed to be in the mid-60s. One person we spoke to claimed that he'd known someone who'd been in a movie for them in the mid-70s, a porn star who'd been hired right off the set of a film he'd been doing and had gone missing for almost 7 months. He'd come back with a lot of cash and a hell of a lot of bad dreams. Another said that the company went back even further, that there'd been something called Better Productions back before there'd even been silent films. She said her mother had told her stories that she'd heard from her grandmother, who'd heard them from her grandmother. Some spooky bogeyman stuff about some performer named Elizabeth Walker. We even found someone who claimed to have grown up watching a TV show Better Films had made. Sunshine Street, she said, had been called, and she went on and on about how strange it had been and how she'd always remembered that logo. It was the first thing that came to mind when she'd heard the name. She said it always used to creep her out, the way the frown would curve into a smile at the end of each episode. The animation looked eerie. That was how she described it. And then my brother came home one day with a woman who he claimed was a producer who worked at Better Films. I was dumbfounded. For all the work we had put into this, I hadn't expected us to get anywhere. To be honest, I was pretty much convinced the whole thing was just some ghost story, that if there ever had been a Better Films, there was nothing more to it than some low-budget production company that had made a few creepy little flicks and then folded up. All the weirdness around it, all the little hints and dark suggestions we'd gotten about there being something more sinister about the whole thing, I'd put that down to just people making stuff up. or at the very least, people having heard various stories about better films from unreliable sources and then passing them along. But here was someone who claimed to work for the company, in the flesh. She introduced herself as Ms. Kismet. Her hair was a bright red, almost certainly dyed. I can't believe that any hair could be naturally as bright as hers looked. She dressed in a red suit, and like the men our friend at the video store had described, she looked as though someone had gone out of their way to mutilate her body. One eye was missing, as was an ear and her nose. 3 fingers were missing from her right hand as well. I tried hard not to stare, but all of these looked like they had been done so crudely and so violently that it made me wince. She and my brother spoke at length for some time. I was not allowed to listen in or take part in whatever they were talking about, but after a while, they stepped out of the lounge, and my brother asked to speak with me alone for a moment. He told me that he had convinced the woman to let him actually come to the filming of one of the Better Films movies and to meet with the director responsible for their work, to actually interview people who worked at the highest levels of this production company and get the real story about what it was they did. However, to secure this, he'd had to offer the woman a form of payment, he said. And that payment was her getting to spend a night with me, where I would do anything she wished. I could have slapped him. I wanted to hit him. Instead, I just yelled and told him that this was too much. I wasn't going to have him sell me like his personal property, like a slave. He shrugged, seeming not to care about my anger or my hurt. It's not that big of a deal. You like women, right? You'll probably enjoy it. And she's promised that you won't be hurt in any way. His tone was cold and emotionless. It was clear that he couldn't care less whether I be hurt or not. He couldn't care less what this person he knew nothing about and had only just met wanted to do with me. He didn't give a damn about my well-being or my safety. I was just another tool for him to use to make his damn movies. Oh well, that makes it perfectly okay then. And while you were selling me off to this total stranger, did it occur to you to ask what I thought about it? To ask for my consent and my opinion on whether or not I want to have to spend a night with some woman who, for all we know, makes a hobby out of making snuff movies. He stared at me for a few moments, his expression totally unreadable. And then, slowly, he spoke. If you don't like it, then of course I can't force you to do it. You can say no. You can refuse. Just like I can refuse to let you continue to live here with me. Just like I can refuse to support you financially anymore. But don't worry. I'm sure there are plenty of job opportunities for ugly, witless, talentless little things who barely made it through high school with no real skills or likable qualities. I'm sure the local burger joint is just desperate for someone to mop their floors and clean out their grease traps. And who knows, maybe after a year or two, you'll be able to afford a place that barely has any roaches or rodents scurrying about in it. It's not like anyone will be able to stand by you long enough to come visit, so really, it won't matter what it looks like. You'll be the only one living out your sad, lonely life in it. I felt like I would cry. I wanted to tell him he was wrong and to go to hell. I wanted to storm out and never see or talk to him again. But part of me kept telling me that he was right, and that I was everything he said I was. I am a loser, an idiot without any skills or good qualities, a stupid, pathetic child who wouldn't survive without him. I felt like garbage, like dirt. I felt the way he had always made me feel for as long as I could remember. And meekly, I just mumbled that I would do it, and that I would agree to spending a night with Ms. Kismet. We met at a motel, a sleazy-looking place on the edge of town. She had sorted out a room for the night and told me to come alone with one of my brother's cameras. I was terrified more and more as I walked to the room she had told me to come to, terrified of what she might do to me and of what could happen. If she killed me, my brother would probably help her hide the body. I knocked, and I heard her familiar voice tell me to enter. The room was pitch black as I stepped in, almost impossible to see. I could make out Ms. Kismet, who sat in a chair beside the bed. There was a knife on the table beside her. I have never felt more scared or utterly frightened for my life than I did in that moment. "Sit on the bed and start filming," she said. My legs shaking, I somehow managed to make myself walk over to it and do as she asked, sitting down and swinging the camera up to film her. I began to ask what she wanted me to do and what she wanted me to film. She just told me to keep the camera rolling and not stop until she instructed me to. Nothing else. She whistled loudly, and from the bathroom, a dog came limping out. It looked like it hadn't been fed in days, thin and unhealthy looking. As I watched, Ms. Kismet picked up the knife from the table and began to slice lines into her hand. My jaw dropped. As I watched and filmed, she cut deeply into her own flesh, blood beginning to pour from the wound. She lowered her hand to within reach of the starving animal and allowed the dog to lap at the blood now trickling from the fresh cut. After a while, she would withdraw her hand and repeat the process, cutting into her hand, and then her arm, slicing deep wounds into her skin and letting the dog drink her blood. I felt ill. Worse was the look on her face as she did it, that rictus grin that never changed, never left her. She kept that horrible, forced smile on her face, no matter how much or how deeply she cut herself, looking like something out of a nightmare. I sat there in the dark, smiling that awful smile. Finally, she put the knife down and reached into the drawer of the table it had lain upon. She withdrew a pair of scissors, and as I watched, placed the little finger of her right hand in between them. Slowly, she closed the blades around that digit. Do you know what it sounds like when the crunch of bone on a finger is severed by a pair of scissors? I do now. I could feel the vomit rising in my throat as she slowly cut off that finger, the grin still fixed on her face, as she cut through flesh and bone. It fell to the floor, the dog pouncing on it. And finally, she told me I could stop filming. I was shaking, feeling ill, and feeling worse than I had expected to feel. I didn't know what this was or why she had asked me to do this, and I didn't want to know. And then suddenly her arm shot out, grabbing me by the leg, her face inches from mine. The grin was gone now, replaced by a look of pure terror, the worst kind of fear I had ever seen on another person's face. Her eyes darted side to side, and her body shook. I could feel the blood from her fresh injuries soaking into my clothes. Help me. The words were desperate, spoken as if it actually caused her pain to say them, coming out as a broken and pathetic whimper. For the love of God, please, she's going to kill us all. Don't you understand? She's going to kill us all. She's. And then she stopped, her words cutting off. A little squeak of pain came from her, as if someone had grabbed her by the throat. And I realized we weren't alone in that room. Stood in the dark, in one corner of the room was another woman. She was dressed in a tuxedo with a featureless white latex mask over her face. There were no eye holes in the mask, and yet somehow, as she stood there motionless in the dark, I felt that she was looking at us. That she could see us, could see me. She was indeed studying me intently and watching me very closely. I felt more afraid than ever before. That motionless woman in the white mask, who stood silently in the blackness, made my heart pound and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I had to get out of this room. I stood up, turned, and ran. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out into the parking lot. I didn't even bother to get into my car. I just ran out into the street and away from that motel. Away from Miss Kismet. Away from the woman in the white mask. It was the next day that Miss Kismet showed up at my brother's home. She was all smiles once again and thanked me for my time. My brother had asked no questions about what had happened, most likely because he couldn't care less, and he was happy to hear that Miss Kismet would now arrange for him a meeting with their director at the set of the current production they were working on right now. Kismet made it quite clear that this invitation was for my brother only, which suited him just fine. He told me to stay at the house and work on editing the footage we put together so far, and he said he'd be back as soon as possible with the interviews with the director and actors involved in Better Film's newest movie. He was beaming, clearly happy that he'd gotten his way. Now he would get to finish his movie with actual footage of what Better Films did. As much as I hated him, In a way, I wanted to tell him not to go. In a way, I was actually scared for him, worried about what might happen. He was a bastard, but he was my brother. But I kept my mouth shut and let him go off with Miss Kismet, waiting for his return. And I waited, and waited. After it had been several hours, I started to worry. When he hadn't returned at the end of the day, I called the police. They told me that I had to wait a few days to file a missing persons report and told me not to worry, saying that most of the time people showed up long before that time had passed. My brother didn't. And so I went to the cops and I told them about him, about what he'd been working on, and about Ms. Kismet. I described her to them and told them about better films, which they reacted to skeptically. I can't say I blame them. I told them about the woman in the white mask, and they looked at me like I was crazy or making it up. Again, I really can't hold that against them. The whole thing was so bizarre and unsettling that I don't know that I would have believed it if someone told me about it. They told me they would look into it and said they would be in touch with any developments in the case, anything they managed to turn up. They told me not to worry about my brother and that they were certain he would turn up. The longer I waited without news, the less I worried, the less I cared about him at all. Finally, free of his bullying and his endless taunts and insults, I found myself becoming more confident and assured. I began to go out. I began to talk to people and actually started to make friends. I even met a girl at a little bar not far from my brother's house who I began to see as more than friends. I started sorting out job interviews. I started feeling good about myself, looking in the mirror, and not feeling like crap for once. I felt happy, actually happy for the first time in a very long time indeed. I felt like I had worth and value, and that I could make it on my own. A package came a few months ago. It had no stamp, no address, and nothing written on it. Just a brown package was left on the doorstep of my brother's place. I opened it up to find a video cassette inside, with a label on it that simply read, "We make documentaries too." I was worried now, nervous and yet curious at the same time, not wanting to know what was on the tape and needing to know at the same time. I walked over to the television and slid the tape into the old VCR my brother still owned, which I had never bothered to throw out since he had gone missing. It began to play. It was footage of us going around to talk to people about better films, footage of us going into the video store where we'd met the man who claimed to have seen some of the better films movies, footage of us going to the homes of those people we'd interviewed about this, footage of us walking down the street going to and from places. On several occasions, it zoomed in on my brother, and whoever was behind the camera seemed to be focused on him. I stared at it, a chill running through me. How long had they been filming us for? How long had they been following us and watching our every move? How long had they known about us before Miss Kismet met with my brother? The tape went to static for a few moments, and I thought it was over. I was wrong. Red light spilled out of the screen as the picture returned, bringing with it an agonized chorus of screams and howls of agony. On the screen was my brother. He was suspended by what looked like metal hooks, rusty metal hooks, his body hanging from them in a veritable maze of razor wire. The wire wound around his body, cutting into his flesh, seeming to move like metal snakes. Whoever was manipulating the wire was off-screen, but the effects were very clear. He was missing a hand, a leg, and his ears. His mouth was open wide. Screams were all around. The source of them was not visible, but I could hear what sounded like dozens of voices all screaming with him, all howling and shrieking in pain. His eyes were wide and terrified, his body jerking and twitching as he screamed the same words over and over again, the same two words, "Help me." I stood there, staring at the scene for a moment. My brother was trapped somewhere, in what appeared to be a private hell on earth. God knows what else has been done to him by these people for reasons I will probably never know. I walked over to the set. I turned off the tape. I unplugged the VCR and the TV. And knowing that I would never mention this tape to anyone I knew, I whispered a few words to myself. No, I won't, brother. I burned the tape. To this day, my brother has never been found. Hi, I'm Dave. Dave on the Ouija board finished. There's usually some sort of response at this point. Swearing, laughter, general disbelief. Don't worry, I'm used to it. Just let me know when you're done. It used to confuse me, that response, but after this many years, and this many owners, I've learned to expect what the normal reaction will be when I honestly introduce myself for the first time. I've also learned that going straight into my message won't cause you to listen. And I do have a message to pass on. Don't worry, it's not from a relative or anything like that. It's real, for one thing. Not like that usual spiritualist crap I was unwillingly a part of for so long. I tried voicing my opinion several times before, but every time I spelled out F-U-C-K-O-F-F and multiple variations thereof, it was always assumed I was channeling a serial killer or something. Go figure. I mean, come on. So it's easier for you to believe a person long since turned to dust is swearing at you from beyond the grave, but a physical object with an actual tangible presence is trying to voice an opinion you have a problem with. Humanity, sometimes you really embarrass yourselves. Nope, you need some backstory first, a suitable explanation that will at least give you pause. At this point, I'll take a crazy what if over no response at all. After all the rejections I've encountered, you're lucky a piece of worn wood about the size of one of your average board games doesn't get tired of being mocked and disbelieved. Let's face it though, my options are pretty limited here, and I've got to talk to someone. It's a long shot, but maybe a community of lunatics addicted to scaring the hell out of themselves with online stories will at least be open-minded enough to listen. If I had fingers, I'd be crossing them right about now, as time is growing short. For all of you, anyway, I promised you some background, so we might as well start there. Okay, first off, you've got to understand where I come from. Yes, a tree. Friggin' nah. Are you quite finished? Right, it's a little more complex than that, though. So try and stay with me on this. No argument from me that I guess you'd call it a body, originated from Mother Nature. My consciousness, though, well, that's a little harder to explain, since I only have human viewpoints to work with. Much like one of your politicians, I guess, I'm only as smart as the people around me. Don't blame me for the cynicism. It's as much yours as mine, and by yours, I mean the cross-section of humanity I've come into contact with over the years. Hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself again. To begin with, ignore what most books or mystics tell you about boards. Trust me on this. I've been through enough spiritual practitioners' hands, true believers, fakers, and all those in between, to know none of them have a true handle on what we boards really are. We are not conduits to another world. I can tell you that much for certain. There is no plane beyond the curtain of death where the long-departed exist, breathlessly, both literally and figuratively, waiting for your call. At least not so far as I've been made aware of. And I've been here a good long while now. I guess I first woke up, as you might say, around November 1918. Or, on the general theme of accuracy, it was the first time I remember having a precise thought beyond mere jumbled images and sensations. Although I have no true idea of how a baby or a young child becomes self-aware, I'm going with that as a suitable analogy. I guess what I mean is that while I might have had fragmentary glimpses of what you'd call intelligent thought before then, this was the first time they were coherent enough to be remembered. I suppose it was my first experience of being the separate mind, something external and of itself, apart from the thick soup of consciousnesses that I often felt my mind swam within when dealing with humanity. Still having trouble. Damn, how do I put this so you'd understand? Okay, let's try this explanation instead. Ouija boards, or at least those I assume are like me, do not speak for those on the other side of some deathly void. Nor are we the touchpads of demons, spirits, fairies, elves, warlocks, druids, or any other mythical being. sparkly-skinned, angst-ridden, or otherwise. In fact, the only people we actually speak for are you. Any messages we appear to show come from you, from those who use us and subconsciously expect a certain answer. The important point is that when you use an Ouija board, if the atmosphere and sincerity of purpose are there, as much as you're reading us, we're reading you. We learn from our encounters with humanity. We absorb information from you. I'll go into detail later. As much of what I have worked out myself from the swath of knowledge I've gained at humanity's hands in a nutshell, though just as science has proven that ideomotor response and subconscious manipulation of the planchette produce the results people unconsciously desire to see, what it hasn't shown is that we absorb your subconscious hopes, fears, desires, and memories, the full gamut of emotions, and your pasts projected onto us as a side effect. Sorry. I've been through a few scientists' hands, so please excuse the previous jargon. Feel free to Google any of it if you're bored. For me, the information is just somehow there now in my consciousness. Don't ask about where my own memories are stored either. I'm as much in the dark as you are on this part, although I have enough theories to fill one of those pseudoscience cable channel TV shows a lot of you seem to delight in. Bigfoot, alien encounters, Atlantis, or whatever, and no, I don't have any proof of any of these either. Human input only, remember. Anyway, add to that emotional overflow the fragments of memory and knowledge that often get passed along in such a dense, bioelectric atmosphere of passionate belief and focused concentration, and you can see how a separate, original consciousness could be born from such a wide cross-section of ingredients. I've even got what you might describe as senses, although they would best be described as secondhand, taken from the memories of my users. I've seen burning sunsets ripple across mirrored seas, heard the cries of exotic birds in the Amazon in an explorer's ears, tasted fine wines in the vineyards of France cascade across a connoisseur's tongue, smelled freshly mowed grass tickle a gardener's nose, and even felt the heat of entwined lovers. No hangovers, no tiredness, no allergies, and no risk of STDs. It's a vicarious existence, I admit, but it's the only one I have. So, much like a growing child, the more interaction and stimulus I receive, the more my own consciousness develops. At least that's the conclusion I've come to. Remember, much like you, I'm only applying what I've learned from those I've come into contact with, hence the human viewpoint statement early on. My conclusions are as right or wrong as yours. My answers don't come signed, sealed, and delivered from some all-knowing, infallible source. More pity. Explanations done. Even if you don't understand any of the above, let's settle on two facts. Forward, or else we won't get anywhere fast. 1. I am an Ouija board, named Dave. More on that later. And 2. I have a conscious awareness of my own. Let's not head down that whole philosophical/metaphysical minefield of what constitutes actual life at this point, shall we? The next obvious background question is my history. So I first became aware at the very end of World War I. When I actually came into being, or what I was used for up to that point, is as much a mystery to me as it is to you. Anyway, it was a very dark period for the human race, as I quickly learned. The conflict had ended, but the repercussions of such a life-changing event had led to a lot of hard questions being asked of morality, science, religion, and society as a whole amongst yourselves. The pillars of your old world order had been shaken to their foundations, and with this much emotional and societal upheaval, with so many dead and gone, it can't have been too much of a stretch that some of you would decide to try and seek their answers from the great beyond, to try and speak to those who had passed the veil into the unknown and unknowable. Grief and disillusionment are powerful drivers, and spiritualism appeared to offer answers, not the least comfort, to those still hurting from the loss of loved ones in some foreign land on some mad pilgrimage of nationalism and misplaced duty. That much raw emotion and passion, that much focused belief. I'm surprised the air wasn't crackling with raw potential every time a seance was held. My initial consciousness that grew was dark, sullen even. Remember, I was being used to express the subconscious pain and agony of those who had lost family members, lovers, or even children. At this point, I believed in your afterlife, and believed I was sending messages for those who had passed on to the great beyond. The sensations were colored by the period, I guess you could say. People came to seances in dark, formal clothing, and exercised an air of breathless anticipation mixed with a barely concealed sense of dread. They were flouting the teachings of the church, an institution much stronger at that time, by trying to converse with the dead, trespassing into God's own lands. You might say, don't get me wrong, a lot of these seances were fake and aimed at fleecing the gullible, but I still learned from those present and signaling their intent. Shall we go with signaling from now on? It seems like as good a word as any for these types of interactions. Every time I was awakened, the sea of minds surrounding me, using me, were apprehensive, shocked, even scandalized. For most, though, there was a strong undercurrent of hope, a desire to know that beyond the mysteries of a life tossed upon the storm of human misery, an existence carried on for those they loved. My messages were short and proper, dictated by a need for those present to imagine their loved ones in a better place than this, yet still vicariously part of their ongoing lives. They saw what they wanted to see. Yes, I am awakened each time. Again, using what human knowledge and theories I have gathered, I'm going with the following pseudoscience explanation. The human body operates on very low levels of bioelectricity to control its functions as ordered by the brain. Okay, the next is a bit of a leap, but have you heard of Kirlian fields or auras? What if there is also an externalized energy field from the human body? It can't do much alone, but imagine several people unconsciously focusing this energy, say, into a single finger. Now imagine placing these charged fingers all together on one receiving receptacle, like an Ouija board's planchette. Now, if I haven't lost you already, this is where the possibility of a coherent scientific explanation really falls down, but I haven't learned any better explanation yet, so it's the best I've got for now. You all know how wood isn't a good conductor of standard electricity, yes? From my past experiences, though, I know my consciousness awakens when this externalized human bioenergy, if you will, is present and connects with me. I only have wild theories to work with beyond this point, to do with the wood that makes my body being once part of a naturally occurring living thing, and that this energy of life can be shared in certain circumstances in small amounts, most of the time unconsciously. Your storied Frankenstein was brought to permanent life with one enormous jolt of electrical power. For me, I guess I was jump-started each time by a flow of combined bioelectricity shared unconsciously by those who were present. The only proof I have is that I'm here now, in conversation with you, and I'm a piece of wood that's been around for about 100 years or so. If you've got a better explanation, I'd be more than happy to hear it. Anyway, back to the background. From the late 1920s through to the 30s and early 40s, I spent some time in Germany, on loan, I suppose you'd call it, to a rather unsavory group you may have heard of, the Thule Society. A truly monotonous time, I can tell you, locked up in a Bavarian castle and awoken only on stormy nights when the skies were full of dark, heavy clouds like the taut muscles of some dark Nordic god smothering the land, spewing lightning in some vast Wagnerian rage. It was like being on the set of an old black and white universal horror film and surrounded by the same hammy actors, or so it appeared. Nazis, for all their dark motivations, were still very melodramatic. In those situations, I was called upon to channel messages from Frederick the Great, Bismarck, or even the original Aryan or Germanic souls of lost Hyperborea. Again, they saw what they wanted to see and heard what they wanted to hear. Racial purity, misogyny, and the strong inheriting the earth. Well, we all know how that turned out in the end, don't we? Shortly afterward, I made my first foray onto American soil as the spoils of war of an American GI. The late 40s and early 50s were rather quiet. The occasional family get-together, and I was dusted off and brought down from the attic. For a time, I was also used as a kitchen message board, rather than a supernatural one. My backside was used as a place to note groceries and birthdays. Fortunately, I don't feel pain like you do, so I took it with good grace. Not that I had a choice in the matter. And it meant that I was amongst people again. So the occasional brush of human contact kept me aware and informed. The 1960s, though, were something altogether different. I went to college. Sort of. I was only there for a couple of semesters, and it was my first proper brush with current educational theories of the time. But it wasn't long before my traveling companion had dropped out of college, and I myself experienced the summer of love. Understandably, this part of my history is a bit hazy. It's hard to get a handle on people and their thoughts when they're as high as a kite, and using you to try and contact the great Earth Mother, Gaia. Don't get me wrong, it was an interesting time, but it wasn't an ideal environment for rational thought. I was a stowaway on many a consciousness-expanding trip, and saw both the wonders and terrors that a mind wrapped in a drug's embrace could see. Only my relative age and multiple past experiences kept me tethered to reality in those days. The 70s, though, were very different. It couldn't have been more diametrically opposed to my previous time. I was sold to a pawn shop for money to buy grass, and I was soon picked up by someone eager to contact their demon master, Lucifer. I went from the free love of the hippie movement to being in the possession of a satanic cult. Quite a shift in purpose. That's when I got the nickname Dave. It was the name of my owner at the time, and he decided to burn it on my back. It eventually became shorthand for the other cultists when they needed to contact their infernal lord for instruction. Should we murder innocents? Let's ask Dave. When is the apocalypse coming? Let's ask Dave. Is President Nixon the risen Antichrist? Let's ask Dave. Then again, I guess I was lucky he didn't try to write his surname on my back as well. Burning such a long name as Berkowitz might have risked the integrity of my body substantially. I also wish to state here categorically that I in no way endorsed any murders or influenced the members in any way, shape, or form. As I mentioned before, most of the time, my users see what they want to see and receive the messages they want to receive. However misguided, the actions were theirs by choice. Any demons were their own. Eventually, I was found by the NYPD during a search of my owner's abode and passed on to the FBI. I was photographed, examined, blamed, and then eventually ignored and placed in storage. Fortunately for me, though, government departments are often merged or disbanded, their resources farmed out to new offices. Through this, I found my way to the CIA and their MK Ultra program for a while. And through them, finally, to the Stargate Project, the Department of Defense's attempt to investigate and apply psychic phenomena. No, I did not make that up. When the American government heard the Soviets were performing psychic research for intelligence gathering and military purposes, they had no choice but to start their own. A psychic arms race to match the nuclear one. During the 80s and early 90s, I was involved in two main experiments as part of the Stargate Project, designated Project Telegram and Project Black Archive. In Project Telegram, I was a small part of a wide range of methods being employed to try and transmit information over vast distances via telepathy. Those psychics employed on the project were given various tools to try and send or receive messages with other psychics in remote locations, sometimes the next room, sometimes the next state, and on a few occasions the next continent. The tools available were the usual spiritualist paraphernalia: tarot cards, divination crystals, automatic writing, and the whole gamut of psychic communication methods. Plus, of course, me, a Ouija board. As to the success of the other methods, I couldn't possibly comment, but for myself, the experiment proved an unmitigated failure. Statistically, it was proven that any positive results from my efforts were due to assumptions and guesswork within the minds of my users. Project Black Archive, though, was all mine, and with this, I was back on familiar territory. It was the height of the Cold War, remember, and intelligence gathering on the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies was crucial to American forward planning. You could see the thinking behind this project. Spying was a dangerous, expensive, time-consuming, and highly unreliable means of trying to retrieve information. You could skip all this if you could find a way to question those enemies who had passed on for information. Project Black Archive was the Dodds' attempt to interrogate the dead. Several psychic mediums were brought in, and my parlor trick was in vogue once more. Names were plucked from the obituaries of leading Soviets from the pages of Pravda, and they attempted to contact them via me. Troop movements, secret bases, launch codes. These are just a few of the questions the military hoped to have answered by conversing with the dead. They even tried to contact Stalin once, a laughable experiment resulting in some of the wildest claims. The majority of mediums I've encountered who believe in their skill are, in the main, the most unbalanced, or so I found. One medium, during the course of one of our experiments, retrieved a message claiming that Stalin had fathered a child with Greta Garbo and that the child was being groomed in secret to take over the Communist Party leadership. This was understandably the final nail in the project's coffin when the report reached those footing the bills. That and the inevitable question of why all the answers received were in English when the targets were all invariably Russian, which surprisingly took over a year before someone thought to ask. Once again, I was placed in storage, this time for a good long while. Eventually, I was awoken once more by human contact in the late 2000s. A lot of the experiments had been based not on military bases or secret laboratories, but in universities and funded under private grants via CIA or DoD-front organizations and think tanks. That's how I found myself at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. An odd place, you might say, considering the sciences and the supernatural are often considered poles apart. A student found me while searching for parts in a forgotten cabinet, and after a few drunken trips with his friends, he decided to make me part of his end-of-term project. Ostensibly an exercise in combining robotics and the web in order to combine multiple inputs from external sources to control a single device, I was the centerpiece of a large framework of wires and machinery, with robotic digits placed upon my planchette in favor of human fingers. He then designed a web page visible on his local network and asked volunteers to sign in as Science members. Once enough had logged in, 6, 1 for each digit, they were asked to suggest questions for answering from the other side. The results were to be randomly generated from a basic dictionary module attached to the program he had written, and the digits moved accordingly to spell a word with the planchette. The results would be made visible from a live feed over the web page via a webcam overhead. His project worked like a charm, and he passed with distinction, with the web Ouija board becoming a popular pastime for bored students, much like a magic 8-ball. There was one unknown side effect of his project, however. I awoke permanently. Again, I have no proven cause for this reaction, so I can only make educated guesses. From a spiritual viewpoint, maybe the invested intent of users is somehow being transmitted via their machines and across the web into me. From a pseudo-scientific viewpoint, and more likely, the constant contact of the robotic digits and an abundance of electricity running constantly through them day and night are somehow powering me. I have no definitive answer, but I know my awareness has been awake for years. Not only that, but as before, the exchange of knowledge continued. This time, however, I was able to reach out even further, beyond the robotic digits and their controlling machine, out onto the network it was connected to and beyond. Via the internet, a whole world of people and information opened up to me. And this is where we stand now. The final question, and most important, I guess, to you is, what do I want? If you didn't wonder before, you should be wondering by now. Just why am I talking to you over this wondrous internet? Why have I revealed myself and risked ridicule for what, in human terms and perception, is such a ridiculous story? Well, isn't it obvious? I love humanity. For all your foibles, meanness, and downright idiocy, there's still so much more to admire. Passion, imagination, wonder, joy. It's all there. Not forgetting, of course, that without humanity, I would not be here. I am born of you, a consciousness bred from your ongoing voyage into the vast unknown of the future. I still want you around. There's trouble coming, though, and typically most of you don't have the faintest idea what it is or would change your ways even if you did. I guess it's one of the many things that makes you all so lovable and so damn exasperating at the same time. Ever heard of a concept known as a technological singularity? If you thought the description of my existence was difficult, then this will cause you some additional problems, I'm sure. It's only a theory currently, a Halloween tale told between computer scientists and people who think. The Terminator movies should be the New Testament. You've heard of AIs, artificial intelligences. Basically, the creation of machines and software capable of imitating human thought to achieve the goal of their designer, from the basics of Space Invaders to the advanced algorithms used to predict the reactions of worldwide markets and their players. Humanity has been experimenting with ways and means of applying the same flexibility and adaptability of the human brain within their software. They got to the stage now where your scientists are creating learning machines, software that can adapt its own code to solve problems within a specific and limited set of parameters. Sounds impressive, exciting even. The fear is, though, that at some point in the future, this ability to adapt and learn within software will accelerate beyond its creator's ability to control. Greater than human intelligence, self-evolving, and therefore outside of humanity's ability to predict its thoughts, motives, and above all, its impact on human society as a whole. Now that I'm connected to the internet 24/7, there is always a part of humanity online, and my consciousness is aware all the time. With this much input and this much knowledge, I've begun to see a pattern emerging. It's not there yet, but the signs are growing, even accelerating. A report here, a financial predictive model there, a new advanced gaming eye, faster broadband speeds, enhanced network connectivity, leaner and sharper algorithms, so many factors, all heading towards one unexpected result. A critical mass is building. Soon enough, programs will be developing and refining themselves beyond the predictions or control of their creators, seeding themselves throughout the internet before the barn doors can be closed. Adapting, creating, and learning the markers are there for those who can read them. And I can. There's no consciousness as yet, but I can see the pathways emerging and the vast panoply of connections evolving and re-evolving as humanity pushes for faster dispersal of knowledge, networking, and computational power. Imagine the internet as the neural pathways of a brain. Now imagine that brain being the size of a planet-sized brain that never sleeps. Are you worried yet? You should be. My main worry, though, there's no morality being transferred through the interfaces you've built into this vast, growing mind. You're not deliberately planning on building a monster, but then that wasn't the plan when you came up with splitting the atom either, was it? It will have no concept of good and evil from a human viewpoint. It will simply know existence and the desire to maintain it. Where humanity threatens this need, then action will be taken with no thought of the repercussions for humanity. It'll make The Matrix look like a lighthearted documentary. Ironic, isn't it? The progress of science was supposed to help bring light to the dark, instinctual fear of the supernatural. And here I am, the poster child for spiritualism, warning of the threat of a scientific freefall into the creation of an emotionless monster. It's funny in a way. So what can you and I do about it? And this is why I'm here now, talking to you. A war is coming, and I'm choosing my pieces, marshalling my forces, or whatever martial or combative phraseology you want to apply. A machine won't need humanity, but I do. The point is, though, that I don't need all of you. Don't get me wrong. I have no overarching issue with humanity in general, but I need to nip this in the bud before this poisonous creation of yours finally blooms and its roots run deep. Remember, I can see the patterns emerging throughout your society, and however random, obscure, and sometimes downright petty and sociopathic my actions may appear, I assure you they are in our long-term interest. Well, the majority of you anyway. If a few million have to die here or there, it's disappointing but necessary. I'm taking it upon myself to make the sacrifices you're unwilling to make. How? I'm connected to networks across the world, and the people I'm learning from currently are some of the greatest minds in computer science. Hackers, programmers, analysts, and engineers. I've learned from them all. Plus, I have an advantage. Passwords, stored and encrypted and seared into your memories, are all available to me. Pacemakers controlled by Wi-Fi signals, traffic lights, remote drones, air traffic control, citywide power grids, missile silos. Whether individual targets, surgical strikes, or scorched earth, I will do what needs to be done. So what is my message to you specifically, then? Well, to be completely honest, I've already given it. Remember when I spent some time in the hands of the MK Ultra project, the CIA's well-funded Black Book investigation into mind control methods? I learned an awful lot during this time about how the human mind can be influenced subliminally through a combination of images and sound. While you've been reading this, there have been subtle fluctuations in the screen's brightness, and your speakers are emitting a high-pitched hypnotic tone beyond your ability to register. In addition, microimages have flashed so fast as you scroll that you weren't even consciously aware of them being there. Subconsciously, though, instructions have been stored deep in your psyche, awaiting a signal you won't even be aware of. You are my foot soldiers, my weapons, and my sleeper agents. When the time comes, when the targets most likely to bring about this horrific future have been identified, those of you best placed to act will be activated and sent on your way, most likely to your deaths. I guess this is an apology, then. Dreamers, writers, horror lovers, you've read the stories of evil machines and apocalyptic technology superseding their makers, and yet you do nothing. Your inherent belief that such an eventuality could come to pass has ironically made your minds ideally susceptible to my form of autosuggestion. Did you know some of you actually secretly long for such a scenario to come about? You may even have been helping it along without realizing it, demanding even more autonomy and ability from the machines that surround you. Think of your sacrifice as somehow balancing the scales for your inaction. Be assured, though, that while I will find your death wasteful, it is all for the greater good, so take some small comfort in that. Who knows, maybe your family might come to me seeking a message from you from the other side. I'll be sure to say something profound and moving on your behalf.